I would love to go and see this dress in person and be able to take in the entire manner and the entire context of the exhibit. However, I am in Canada and the dress is currently on display at Kedleston Hall in England. Hey folks! If you've been here for a while, you may recall that a few years ago I did a little video on something called the Peacock Dress. This artifact became quite well known online when a historical costumer by the name of Kathy Hay wanted to recreate this dress and began documenting the various steps in order to do so on her YouTube channel. But there came a question of whether or not this garment should be recreated due to its extremely colonial history, and the project was ultimately cancelled. To make a long history short, the peacock dress was made for the wife of the Viceroy of India at a time when India was under the thumb of England, and it wasn't a great time for India. The dress itself is beautiful, a masterwork piece of finery. It also functions quite well as a symbol of England's colonization of India, which again, not a great time for the Indian people. This opened a very interesting discussion that spilled into some odd corners of the internet, including my own. When it came to the discussion of whether or not this dress should be recreated, I didn't have much to contribute because I'm not a historical costumer and I am not of Indian heritage. However, when it comes to discussing controversial artifacts and displaying colonial history in museums, that is within my wheelhouse. I was in England recently. And while I was there, I took a train ride north up to Derby to Kedleston Hall, the traditional seat of the Curzon family and the current home of the Peacock Dress. And I want to tell you about what I saw while I was there. So I am in Derby, England right now, and I'm going to be heading out to Kedleston Hall in a few hours. And I've got some bad news, because apparently the peacock dress is not currently on display. Which was a little disappointing to hear, but it's getting some very much needed conservation work, and I think this is an important object because it's sparked such an interesting conversation and it needs to be preserved. As far as this video is concerned though, I'm still going to be going out to Kedleston Hall to check it out and see what their interpretation is like, because even though the dress isn't there, it's not on display, and there's probably not going to be interpretation about it there, I was never really interested in the dress itself. I was interested in the story about the dress. And I think there's still a lot to talk about Kedleston Hall and the Curzon family that lived there. And I'm really interested because I have heard that they have made some changes, so I'm gonna go and check it out. Yeah, so the peacock dress wasn't there. I'm still gonna talk about the peacock dress, but I actually want to use this as an opportunity to push this conversation a little bit further. My initial video was about what Kedleston Hall and the National Trust were not saying about the peacock dress. This time, I want to discuss what they're not saying about Kedleston Hall and the family that lived there. The peacock dress is one small part of the story of the Curzon family. It is one artifact in a very large collection in a very interesting historic building. Instead of just looking at one item through the lens of the internet from my home in Canada, this time I was able to actually walk the halls and see the way that the National Trust wanted to share the story of the Curzon family. And I learned a lot. Not about the Curzons or about British India, but about England and the way it presents its history. I learned a lot about the National Trust, and I want to share that with you today. If you work at the National Trust and you like what I have to say, I do have a business email on my main channel page, and I am open to some consulting work. But hey, my name is Christia, and on this channel I talk about museums, commentary, and niche historical topics. If you are interested in fashion history and how it is presented in museums, I highly recommend you check out my other video, A Tale of Two Fashion Exhibits, Who Wore It Better. I think that you'll like that one a lot. Also, if you like the sound of my voice so far, consider subscribing. From the moment the house was finished in 1765, visitors were welcome. In the 18th century, you were shown round by the housekeeper, Mrs. Garnet. Reactions varied. The great dictionary maker, Dr. Johnson, grumbled, "It would do excellently for a town hall." If you feel the same, remember that the huge central block was never meant to be an everyday family home. The Northeast Pavilion did that job. It was really intended for grand entertaining and as a temple of the arts in which to display superb paintings, sculpture, and furniture. Kedleston Hall, a neoclassical manor house in Derbyshire, England, is the seat of the Curzon family, an English aristocratic family that can trace their lineage back over 1,000 years and have had more hereditary titles than I care to mention. The original house was torn down, and the beautiful manor house that stands today in the rolling hills of Derbyshire is managed by the National Trust and is open to the public. Kedleston Hall is... there's really no other way to say it. It is beautiful. It's gorgeous. It is 18th and 19th century luxury cranked up to 11. The architect, Robert Adam, was told to spare no expense, and spare no expense he did. I was very excited to visit this site because I was very eager to learn more about the Curzon family, and I'm also always curious just about how a property of this size functions on a day-to-day basis. So I took a cab from Derby proper, and it is a beautiful countryside drive. When you arrive at the property and pay your entrance fee and maybe purchase the little booklet that they have for sale, you are directed to enter Kedleston through Caesar's Hall, which is named after the various bronzed busts of Roman emperors that are set into these little alcoves. There are 16 columns that help support the marble hall, which is located above, and these are reinforced with 12 smaller columns that have reinforced steel cores.
And all of the
library has a more sober, restrained color scheme, with cream white on the walls and plasterwork, establish a new classical civilization on the ruins of the old one. The gilding on this particular painting is, if you look over at this particular color scheme of the curtains, to summarize my thoughts on Kedleston Hall, I thought it was beautiful, cold, and empty. The human element was completely absent. It is a great place to visit if you want to be bored to death about the gilding on paintings and marble columns, though. Some people are into that. That's fine. Myself, and I think most of the general populace, glaze over pretty quick, though. Last year, I had a conversation with a friend of the channel named Cassie, and while we were discussing our favorite museums, we also talked a little bit about this human element that I mentioned, and how it is often lacking in many museums. I think that kind of ties into other things that we've been talking about. It's like, I think what is missing from a lot of museums is like the human element. It's like we're talking about the history of humanity in a lot of these institutions. And yet you're just in this like sterile room with like a statue or something. When you walk from one luxurious room to the next at Kedleston Hall, you do have the option of reading interpretation about that specific room, and it's on these little placards. From a museum design perspective, I actually really like that you can pick up and carry the interpretation with you, especially if it's quite busy. These placards contain a wealth of information about the design of the room that you are in, with discussions of window dressings, wallpaper, flooring, and sometimes discussions of objects on display in the room. Personally, I go to museums to connect with the past, specifically with people from the past. I'm actually totally fine with learning about wallpaper and silverware sets, but it needs to be framed within a story of people. At Kedleston Hall, the objects and the hall itself were a priority above everything and everyone else. People were mentioned in the interpretation, but of the hundreds of people that lived and worked there over the centuries, there were only 2 that I could really tell you anything about, and interestingly, neither of them were Curzons. The first was Robert Adam, who was the architect who designed and decorated Kedleston Hall. He is mentioned on most of those interpretive placards that I mentioned earlier, because he not only had a hand in the overall design of the hall, but also smaller details like furniture and fireplaces. Despite the fact that he seemed to have a huge hand in most details of this place, I feel like I only ever learned about his connections to the hall and what he designed there. Robert Adam has a sizable Wikipedia page and seemed to have lived an interesting life, and it kind of seems like a missed opportunity to just mention him in such a passive way. The other person that you learn quite a lot about is a housekeeper whose name is Mrs. Garnet. She has more text dedicated to her than anybody else who ever lived or worked at Kedleston. And to be clear, I am all for interpretation about domestic staff, and I wish that there had been more of it. But I do find it kind of funny that in this palatial symbol of English aristocracy, a housekeeper gets more screen time than a guy who had a hand in major political movements in British India. But hey, good for Mrs. Garnet. I want to linger a little bit on this domestic staff angle because that is a huge bit that is often missed from heritage house style museums that I think really needs to be addressed. These places would have utterly collapsed if it were not for the teams of servants, cooks, maids, nannies, and housekeepers that looked after not only the physical hall itself, but also the people who lived there. And you might be thinking to yourself, why are they important to this story? Do we even know the names of any of the people who worked here aside from Mrs. Garnet? In general, your average commoner or domestic staff person will leave less of an archival footprint than the people who have a house the size of a mall, but I went and did some digging, and I didn't have to dig that deep to find out more about the people who worked at Kedleston. The first thing I did was dig through digitized newspapers, which just shout out to digitized newspapers. They are just gold mines of information. The clippings that I found show the celebrated work of Kedleston Hall's talented gardener, Mr. Jackson, an obituary of the long-serving butler, James Rice, as well as the comings and goings of staff, not to mention missing dogs, and a blue bodice that was lost on the road by an S. Ingram in 1887. One of the more dramatic tidbits I found involved people attempting to poach game on the property, with the first attempt in 1863 resulting in the serious beating of a Kedleston groundskeeper, and what sounds like a large scuffle in 1873 between over a dozen poachers and seemingly just as many Kedleston keepers and watchers. Something else I thought was interesting is that there are also mentions of donations to charity from servants and staff of Kedleston Hall to the Infirmary Saturday Fund. But I didn't just look at newspapers either. I also reached out to the British Library because I stumbled my way through their website and discovered that they actually have quite a wealth of archival Curzon family material. I was hoping to be able to pick out a few items to pay to have digitized and sent to me, but unfortunately the British Library and the British Museum are still recovering from a cyber attack from a few months ago, and they were unable to accommodate my request. I was back in Canada at this point while I was doing this research. Otherwise, I would have gone to the reading room in person myself, but obviously I couldn't because it's a bit of a commute from Canada to the British Library reading room. And I was really bummed out about it, actually. I was hoping that I'd be able to find some more kind of nuggets of information on the domestic staff at Kedleston Hall. But then I remembered you. People from the United Kingdom are the third highest demographic of people who watch this channel, so I put out the call. Who wants to go to the British Library for me? I don't have a big following, which is fine. I'm just a nobody from Canada, so I kept my expectations low, but then friend of the channel, Mimi, came through. Mimi also has a YouTube channel where she talks about museums and niche historical topics and commentary, and you should also check her out and tell her I sent you, and be nice to her and subscribe to her channel. But between what I found digging around in old newspapers and examining the 1910 beer and washing allowances that Mimi was able to provide for me, I was able to learn about not only the various positions and roles that people worked at Kedleston, but I was also able to get a little snapshot in what it was like to actually work there. But aside from the Mrs. Garnet deep dive, the domestic staff were not mentioned in any interpretation at Kedleston Hall. Discussing the domestic staff is important because they are a part of the story of the hall. Our gut reaction to seeing such an extravagant manor might immediately be to think about balls and fancy dresses and parties and other luxurious things, but none of that is possible without the teams of people working behind the scenes. Also, just because you're not rich, that doesn't mean you're not important. I think the domestic staff have every right to have their story told, as the Curzons do. Speaking of Curzons, I think the biggest missed opportunity at Kedleston Hall was that there was no interpretation discussing the Curzons themselves. As a whole, they are a very large family filled with lots of interesting characters, as most families are. They can trace their lineage back 1,000 years, and they actually do so at Kedleston Hall down the family corridor, which leads to the part of the estate where I believe some members of this family actually still live. Oh, I actually can confirm that they're still there because of this article, and yikes. But going back to that family corridor, there is a floor-to-ceiling graphic that shows that ancient lineage, and it is huge. Of course, as far as Kedleston Hall is concerned, only the last few generations, going back to 1765 when this version of the hall was constructed, are really relevant to any discussions happening about the hall and the goings-on there. But a lot has happened to the Curzon family since 1765, and the Curzons have happened to a lot of other people too. There were a series of Nathaniel Curzons. The first Nathaniel Curzon that I want to talk about was the first Lord of Scarsdale, and he was a gambler as a young man, so he was forced to live abroad until he eventually returned to Kedleston and tore it down to rebuild the extravagant structure that stands in the hills of Derbyshire today. His first son, Nathaniel Curzon, inherited Kedleston Hall and apparently lived quite frugally in comparison to his father, supposedly just despising the idea of spending money on himself. But his son, the George Nathaniel Curzon that lived between 1859 to 1925, is when things get really interesting in this particular family tree, interesting to me at least. He held a number of titles, including Earl, Lord, Marquis, and Viceroy, among some other ones that I'm probably forgetting. He traveled extensively throughout Asia, writing a number of books about the politics of certain regions, and also had an extensive political career that led him to eventually become Viceroy of India. He married the daughter of an American millionaire, allegedly originally just for the money, but it is believed that he did fall in love with Mary later and was devastated at her early death in 1906. As I mentioned earlier, there is a wealth of archival material relating to the Curzon family, but the bulk of it, I think, pertains to this Curzon who served as Viceroy. But any stories or interpretation relating to the Curzon family is not on display at Kedleston. What little information there is was in this little booklet that I paid extra for. And they were not boring people. They were rich, but they were not boring. They led interesting upper-crust lives that I would have really liked to have learned more about. Another thing I also wanted to learn about was the other side of British aristocracy. The human element is completely missing from Kedleston Hall to such a degree that they don't even discuss the people who lived there. So it should come as no surprise that there is no mention of the impact of the Curzon family. They don't even include the good stuff, like how Mary Curzon was a huge advocate for women's hospitals, or how Lord Curzon helped restore the Taj Mahal. But they definitely don't discuss the more unsavory parts of the Kedleston legacy. In the National Trust's interim report on colonialism and slavery, under the Kedleston subsection, they discuss how Alfred Nathaniel Curzon, 4th Baron of Scarsdale, married Blanche Senhouse, granddaughter of Sir Joseph Senhouse, owner of estates in Dominica and Tobago, and in 1776, Senhouse's Dominican plantation and its enslaved people were valued at £11,607. There is also mention of our Viscount George Nathaniel Curzon, who served as Under Secretary of State for India in 1891, and Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905. The report discusses how, during his tenure, he made many reforms, but he opposed demands from Indian nationalists for greater participation in government. It's also mentioned how the aid offered by Curzon's administration during the Indian famine of 1899 and 1900, which killed over 1 million people, was limited. One more thing that is not discussed in that report that I think is worth mentioning is how he opposed women's right to vote and was the co-president of the National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage. The fact that this report even exists is a testament to the fact that I think the National Trust is at least trying. And to be clear, because I know I'm going to get comments about this, you don't need to beat people over the head with these facts, but none of this is mentioned anywhere at Kedleston Hall. It is important to acknowledge where the funds that maintained this hall came from, as well as the unsavory actions of the people who lived there. You can still talk about the gilding and the glitz and the glamour, but you also need to acknowledge the fact that 1 million people in this guy's jurisdiction died of starvation. One thing about that National Trust Interim report is that I mentioned that report in my last video on the Peacock Dress. That video came out in 2021, and that report had been out for about a year. It was 2020 when this report was published. It is now 2024. Yes, it takes time to thoughtfully and effectively redo interpretation. I get it. But, come on. It's been 4 years, and the only thing that you can talk about is the type of stone used to furnish the marble hall. Are you fucking kidding me? There is another troublesome part of Kedleston Hall that I have not discussed yet, and that is the museum that is stored and located within this heritage manor. It is called the Eastern Museum, and it is located at the end of the Hall of Caesars, and it is filled with items that Viscount Curzon acquired through his travels throughout Asia, with many items coming from India in particular. This is also where the Peacock Dress is on display when it is not being conserved. According to that National Trust report, the collection was originally loaned to the Victoria and Albert Museum, but it was arranged as the Eastern Museum at Kedleston in 1925, and is currently the subject of a re-presentation and interpretation project. Let's talk about that a little bit. It appears that there was some new interpretation here over the last decade or so, which I had discussed in the Peacock Dress video, but overall the interpretation in this area is pretty sparse, with seemingly no update to the item labels since 1925. There is, however, a very large panel that addresses how there is work being done to reinterpret the items in this space, and that there is research going into how these items were acquired. This will also presumably include a reinterpretation of the Peacock Dress. While I was there, there was one exhibit case that was interpreted through the eyes of Anisha Parmar, a British Indian jewelry designer and artist. The panel was called My Adornment is My Power, and it discusses how she was invited to choose a few items from the Eastern Museum and discuss them. I really liked this. I thought it was impactful and interesting, but it was quite small, so I wish they gave her a little bit more space to work with. And I also wish that this was presented in conjunction with new interpretations in the Eastern Museum and Kedleston Hall overall. Anisha Parmar is great. I loved her project, but it does feel a little bit like the National Trust is using her as a bit of a band-aid fix. Yes, you should absolutely be inviting local artists and people from different cultural perspectives to come and examine these artifacts and present them through different cultural lenses. Absolutely. Great idea. But as the management of this historic site, you also need to be doing some of the work at acknowledging Kedleston's history. The only mention in all of Kedleston Hall that I saw that mentioned the fact that Lord Curzon was a Viceroy of India was in this museum. One single line in this palatial manor with dozens of beautiful rooms. There are so many different lenses through which you can discuss and interpret Kedleston Hall. You can discuss it from the perspective of British India or British aristocracy. You can discuss it through the lens of class and race, or you could even just focus on things like gardens and hunting and sport. And you could honestly discuss all of this at once. I think that you should. I just think it's a real shame to limit the interpretation to just the architecture. It feels like there is so much potential for learning and education at this historic site, and it is being utterly wasted. One positive thing I will say about Kedleston is that while I was there, the stable was open. From what the person at the services desk told me, it seems like I got quite lucky by visiting on a day when the stable was open, because I guess it's not open every day for some reason. The stable was surprisingly interesting because they actually had interpretation. And it wasn't just restricted to the architecture of the stables. There was also a discussion about the reliance on carriage travel for these big country estates, the work that went into maintaining an entire stable of pedigree horses by groomsmen and stable boys. It felt like real, valuable information was being shared, and I hope that this is the direction that Kedleston Hall will be moving towards in the future. You know, the bar is on the floor at this point, but I actually learned something. If this is the direction that they're going to take the site, why start with the stable? Why start with an outbuilding that apparently isn't even open all the time? That decision makes me scratch my head. I sincerely hope that when I do inevitably find myself in Derby at Kedleston Hall again, I sincerely hope that more monumental changes have been made at this site. I would actually like to see the Peacock Dress in person one day, so I can definitely see myself in this part of England again. But when I do eventually return to Derby, I hope the National Trust has put the work in. I know it's a hard time for heritage sites everywhere because the world economy is on fire, but it's work that needs to be done. I feel like I only used a small portion of the research I did on Kedleston Hall in this video, but I guess that's the way it goes. Hours of research for about 30 seconds of screen time. I hope you enjoyed this unexpected follow-up video. Please let me know what you think in the comments, especially if you have been to Kedleston Hall and seen it in person. Support your local museums, and I hope that you have a wonderful day or evening, and I will see you next time.